happened in Bristol in June 1967.
Yeah.
The reason I'm arresting you
Yeah.
is because the police have investigative material that indicates you are responsible for that rape and murder of Mrs. Dunne, which happened at Britannia Road in Easton, Bristol, June 1967. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you don't mention, when questioned, something that you later align in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence.
What happens when a murder remains unsolved for decades? When the identity of the killer is hidden behind a wall of silence, and a family is left to mourn without ever knowing the why or the who? Is justice still justice if it arrives too late? And can the truth ever truly heal the wounds that fester in the absence of answers?
Could you open the door, please? Just like to speak with you. Could you open the door, please? Thank you very much.
Who are you?
I'll explain. I'm from the police.
You what?
I'm from the police.
What?
Good morning. Hello. I'm from the police.
What's your name?
I'm from the police. My name's Naomi Main. I'm a detective. May I come in, please?
No. You can't come now. I'm just coming now. Where you want to come in for?
I'll explain because it's a bit sensitive. So we'd like to come in and speak to you properly, please.
Eh?
May I come in to speak to you properly?
I mean, look, I've just got up. I'm an old man.
I'm sorry. It's quite early.
I'm very sick. Not well at all.
You're not well?
No.
Okay.
What do you want to? What is it about?
I'll tell you inside because we don't want other people hearing. So can we just come in and get you seated?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's Mr. Headley, yes?
Eh?
Mr. Headley?
Yeah.
Ryland Headley, lovely. Thank you very much. This is my colleague Joe. We've just got a camera recording as well, just so you're aware.
This is the haunting story of Louisa Dunne, a story of a brutal murder, a justice system that failed her, and a family that lived in the agony of uncertainty for over 50 years. Louisa's murder was not just an isolated incident. It was a case that exposed the cracks in the justice system, raised uncomfortable questions about accountability, and forced a community to live in fear for half a century. Who could have taken the life of a frail, elderly woman who lived alone in the quiet, working-class neighborhood of Easton, Bristol? What was the motive behind her violent death? And why did her killer remain free for so long? These questions lingered for decades unanswered, until 2023, when a breakthrough in forensic technology finally revealed the identity of her killer. But by then, the damage had already been done. Could Louisa's life have been spared? What if the system had acted sooner? Or if her case hadn't gone cold for so many years? For over 5 decades, how many other families have lived in the same nightmare of not knowing who took their loved one from them? And why? What if Louisa's family had never seen justice? Would the truth still be sitting in the shadows, waiting to be discovered? The discovery that Ryland Headley, a 92-year-old man, was the one who killed Louisa Dunne in 1967 sent shockwaves through the community and the public. But how did a man with a history of violence manage to evade justice for so long? How is it possible that a convicted rapist, a man who had already shown signs of violence, was able to live out his life without facing the full consequences of his actions? What went wrong in the justice system that allowed this monster to walk free for decades, committing further crimes while Louisa's family lived in uncertainty? Could this have been avoided? Could the signs have been seen sooner? How much of this was negligence? How many other victims had to suffer because the justice system failed to intervene in time? What does this say about our system? Is justice truly blind? Or is it a game of luck? Is it a game of who gets the best resources, the most attention, or the most advanced technology? Or is justice something else entirely? Something that eludes us when we least expect it? For Louisa's family, the lack of justice for so long was not just a missed opportunity. It was a betrayal by the very system meant to protect them. And as Louisa's family and the community finally began to piece together the truth, another, more disturbing question arose. How many cases like Louisa's are still out there unsolved, waiting for that breakthrough moment? How many families live every day with the same uncertainty Louisa's family endured for decades? What happens to the people left behind when a case remains unsolved, when the killer is free to live their life, and the victims' families are left to suffer in silence? Is the justice system doing enough to prevent this? How many Ryland Headleys are still walking free, committing crimes, and leaving a trail of victims behind them? And what does it take to stop a man like Headley before it's too late? But the story doesn't end with Headley's conviction in 2025. It doesn't simply end with the revelation that after 50 years, justice was finally served. Because this story forces us to confront a much bigger question. How many other cases like this are out there, waiting for breakthroughs that may never come? How many families are left to suffer in silence, their loved ones' killers still free to harm others? Could Louisa Dunne have been saved? Could someone have stopped Headley before it was too late? How many more victims are there who will never see justice in their lifetime? These are the questions that demand answers, that will keep you thinking long after the story is ended. It took decades for Louisa's family to get the closure they deserved, and even then, the pain of living without answers was something they could never truly escape. Louisa's case is a story of a justice system that failed to act in time, of lives shattered by the loss of a loved one, and of a community that will never be the same. But it is also a story of hope, because even when the answers seem impossible to find, when the system seems unwilling or unable to act sometimes, just sometimes, justice is still possible. So what does Louisa's case really tell us? Is it a tale of justice found too late, or is it a wake-up call to all of us? Is it a story of the past, or a warning about what could happen if we fail to act in the future? Stay with us as we delve deeper into this case and its many layers. We'll uncover the haunting details of Louisa's tragic death, the failures that allowed a man like Headley to walk free for so long, and the lessons we can learn from this case to ensure that justice is never delayed again. The truth is out there, but is it enough to change the way we view justice? Are we prepared to face the uncomfortable truths that Louisa's case exposes about the criminal justice system? Can we accept the reality that sometimes the road to justice is long, uncertain, and fraught with obstacles? Yet still, it's worth fighting for. This is more than just a cold case. This is a story that calls for action, that demands reflection, and that challenges us to confront the flaws in the system. Will you continue to watch and learn, or will we all just let another tragedy slip away, unsolved and unanswered?
I need to do this.
Where did all this come from? Where did all this from?
We have investigative information, so we have material that suggests that it's yourself, and we need to basically arrest you and take you to the custody so that we can conduct an interview with you, so we can hear, your event and interview about it.
Into what?
Interview you about it and get your account.
Louisa Dunne, born Louisa Jarrett on June 9, 1892, was not just a name in the annals of Easton, Bristol's history. She was a symbol of quiet resilience, a woman whose life would unknowingly echo through time. A life marked by loss, perseverance, and strength. Louisa's story is one of deep human complexity, with her untimely death in 1967 becoming the mysterious hinge upon which decades of unresolved questions would hang. To understand the significance of Louisa Dunne's life, we must first explore her early years, a time before the tragedy that would ultimately define her legacy. Born into a working-class family in Easton, Louisa was a product of her environment, resilient, grounded, and fiercely committed to her community. At 23, she married Edwin Teddy Parker, a respected city councilor and prominent Labour Party figure in Bristol. This marriage would come to define Louisa not only as a wife, but also as a partner in public service. But what made Louisa remarkable was her own unshakable commitment to her community. She didn't simply stand behind her husband. She actively participated in local political life. By the 1920s, she had earned a reputation as a political force in her own right, active in the Labour Party. Louisa was vocal about the causes she believed in, particularly women's rights, a subject very dear to her heart at a time when the political landscape was vastly different for women. In a world where women were still struggling to secure basic rights, Louisa was not just a bystander. She actively campaigned for equality, challenging the norms of the time. As a result, Louisa was slowly becoming a known figure in Bristol's political circles. She was on the path to becoming the mayoress of the city, a position that was expected to bring her even greater influence in the political scene. But the question arises, did Louisa see herself solely as an extension of her husband's career, or was there a deeper, more personal ambition driving her? The first pivotal turn in Louisa's life came in 1931 when her husband, Teddy, unexpectedly passed away. It was a loss that would change the course of her life forever. The woman who had been a dedicated political partner now found herself alone. Louisa had no children to comfort her, no immediate family to lean on. She became a widow at a relatively young age, and while the loss of her husband was devastating, she didn't retreat into the shadows. Louisa continued her public life, though now it was markedly quieter. The community that had once looked to her as a rising political star would now see her as a figure of resilience, a woman who had learned to cope with grief on her own terms. But was Louisa truly able to cope, or did she simply mask the pain of her loss behind her continued public engagement? Was she perhaps lost in her own identity as a partner to Teddy, now struggling to find meaning in a life that had once been defined by him? It's a thought-provoking question. How does one redefine oneself after the loss of such a central figure? Her life remained relatively quiet for the next few decades. Though Louisa did not actively seek the spotlight after Teddy's death, she was still involved in her community, just not as intensely as she had once been. She lived modestly on a pension and kept her home, surrounded by memories of her past life. But the inevitable march of time brought more sorrow. In 1938, Louisa's second husband also passed away, compounding her isolation. With no children, no immediate family, and no close relatives living with her, Louisa's life became increasingly solitary. Yet, Louisa's isolation raises a compelling question. Could the very things that made her so steadfast and resilient, her commitment to the community and her political values, have also kept her emotionally distant from others? Was she a woman lost in the memories of what could have been, unable to forge new connections, yet unable to sever the ties of her past? By the time Louisa reached her mid-70s, she had become a known, but largely solitary figure in Easton. Living in a modest home at 58 Britannia Road, she was no longer the politically active force she once was. Yet, she still remained a fixture in her community, a friendly, though somewhat withdrawn presence. Neighbors would describe her as warm but lonely, someone who had seen much in her life, but who now lived in relative quiet. Her days were spent alone, supported by her pension, with no immediate family around her. The once vibrant woman who had been at the forefront of political discussions and community gatherings now lived a life of reflection and solitude. Her home in Easton, though modest, was an anchor for her. This was where she had lived her most significant years. The house, perhaps, was a silent companion to her, constant, familiar, and undisturbed. She had no obvious enemies, no visible signs of turmoil. And yet, as she entered her final years, the quiet life she led would soon be shattered. It was within the walls of this home, at 58 Britannia Road, that Louisa's story would take an unexpected and tragic turn. For despite the quiet life she had led, one could ask, could Louisa's peaceful existence have been the calm before an unforgiving storm? Was her isolation part of what made her a target? Or, in a more chilling thought, was Louisa's life meant to be one of quiet suffering, living through the pain of past losses and regrets, never fully healing, until her life was violently taken? June 28, 1967, dawned like any other day in Easton. Louisa had no reason to suspect that this ordinary Wednesday would be the last she would see. As she went about her quiet routines, few could have predicted the horror that was about to unfold in her home. On that fateful day, Louisa was found dead in her house. The details surrounding her death were as puzzling as they were disturbing. She had been assaulted, raped, and strangled. Yet, the police found no signs of a break-in or forced entry, no indication of robbery, and no obvious clues pointing to a specific suspect. Her murder, though brutal, was shrouded in mystery. Why was Louisa targeted? Was it random? Or did someone from her past, someone who knew her, have a role to play in her untimely death? The police would spend months investigating, even going so far as to take 19,000 fingerprints from people living in and around Easton. Yet, despite the exhaustive effort, they would find no suspect. Louisa's killer remained elusive. What drove her attacker to commit such a heinous crime? Was it a crime of passion? Or was Louisa's death the culmination of something darker? Something premeditated? Was the murderer someone who had known Louisa, perhaps someone who once looked at her as a figure of political significance? Someone who resented her strength, her independence? Or was it simply the work of a stranger, a random act of violence that would never be understood? The case soon became one of the UK's most prominent unsolved murders, and as the years passed, Louisa's death became a cold case, quietly buried under the weight of time. Yet, despite the silence, questions lingered. Louisa had been a part of Easton for decades. What happened that night in her home? What did the killer want? And what made Louisa so vulnerable in her final moments? The answers remained elusive, haunting not only the detectives who worked on the case, but also those who had once. What made Louisa a symbol of strength and community, so vulnerable in her final years? Was she a victim of circumstance? Or was there something more to her death? Something that had been brewing beneath the surface of her quiet existence? As we move into the next chapters of this documentary, we will revisit the investigation, the breakthroughs, and the relentless pursuit of justice that would eventually bring Louisa's killer to light after more than 50 years. But for now, we must live with these questions and reflect on the life of a woman who, despite the quiet manner in which she lived, left an indelible mark on the community she called home. The story of Louisa Dunne is not just a tale of tragedy. It is a reminder that even in the most seemingly mundane lives, there are layers of complexity and untold stories. And as we continue to search for answers, we are reminded that some mysteries, no matter how deeply buried, always find a way to surface. The truth, like Louisa, cannot be forgotten. The night of June 28, 1967, was supposed to be just like any other night in the Easton neighborhood of Bristol. Yet in the quiet, unassuming home of 75-year-old Louisa Dunne, a brutal and senseless crime would unfold, a crime that would shock the local community and leave behind more questions than answers. The details of Louisa's death, the investigation that followed, and the absence of any immediate resolution turned her murder into one of the UK's most enduring cold cases. But what exactly happened on that fateful night, and why would anyone want to harm Louisa, a woman known for her quiet, community-driven life? It was the following morning, June 29, 1967, when Louisa's neighbors noticed something was amiss. Normally, Louisa could be found in her front garden, tending to her plants or chatting with passers-by. But on this particular morning, her house stood eerily silent. Concerned, a neighbor knocked on her door. When there was no answer, the neighbor entered through an unlocked door and discovered Louisa's lifeless body inside. The scene was one of stark violence. Louisa had been assaulted and strangled to death, her body found in a state that suggested a violent struggle. Yet, there were no signs of a break-in. The house showed no obvious signs of ransacking or forced entry. This strange detail left the investigators baffled. Was this the work of a known intruder, or could the murderer have had access to Louisa's home in some other way? The police were left with more questions than answers from the start. As the investigation unfolded, the police focused on a number of possible leads. They considered robbery as a potential motive, but the evidence didn't align with this theory. Nothing was taken from the house. There were no valuable items missing, and Louisa's possessions were undisturbed. Her pension, which she relied on to get by, remained untouched. So what was the motive? If robbery wasn't the reason behind the crime, what did the killer want? Was there something personal at the heart of Louisa's murder, or was it simply an act of random violence? In the wake of Louisa's tragic death, the police launched a full-scale investigation. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, hoping to uncover any clues that might point to a suspect. They examined Louisa's relationships. Was there anyone who had a motive to harm her? Was there any indication of foul play in her past? Her neighbors remembered her as friendly but solitary, and none seemed to have a clear answer. Louisa had no known enemies, and no one could think of anyone who might wish her harm. Could the perpetrator have been someone who knew her? Someone from her past? Or was this a random act of violence? The police also collected thousands of fingerprints from the neighborhood. Nearly 19,000 prints were taken from people who lived in or around Easton. This painstaking effort was the result of the recognition that any clue, no matter how small, could lead them to the killer. The investigation was thorough, but it yielded little. Despite these extensive efforts, the police had no tangible leads. No fingerprints linked to the crime scene, no witnesses came forward, and no suspect emerged. In fact, after months of investigation, The case began to cool. As time passed and the investigation stalled, the memory of Louisa's murder faded from public attention. She had been an elderly woman, living alone in a quiet home. And as the case turned cold, so too did the interest in solving her murder. But was this the end of the road for Louisa? Was justice for her impossible? Or was something else at play? Something that would take decades to uncover? Louisa Dunne had been a fixture of her community. She was not wealthy, nor was she particularly well known outside of her neighborhood. She had no enemies, at least none that were apparent. The murder of an elderly woman living alone in a quiet neighborhood would typically be seen as a crime of passion, a personal vendetta, or perhaps a robbery gone wrong. But the more investigators dug into Louisa's life, the more they realized there was no obvious reason why she would be targeted. She had outlived her peers and led a modest, uneventful life. So, what was the motive behind her death? Was Louisa's murder the result of a deep hidden grudge? A random encounter gone wrong? Or was there something much darker lurking beneath the surface of her seemingly quiet life? These questions loomed large over the investigation, and the lack of answers added to the growing sense of frustration that the authorities felt. Could it be that Louisa's quiet life had obscured a darker truth? Was there something in her past that, over time, had caught up with her? Something that would only reveal itself many years later? What if the person who had killed Louisa was someone from her distant past? Someone who had a personal vendetta or a history with her that had been forgotten or buried by time? As the investigation stalled, these questions became harder to answer. The trail went cold, and Louisa's murder was categorized as just another unsolved case, swept into the growing list of cold cases that dotted the annals of unsolved crimes across the country. There was one possible avenue the police considered in the aftermath of Louisa's death, a possibility that sent chills through the investigative team. Louisa's second husband had died several years before her, and Louisa had lived alone for some time prior to her murder. Was her husband's death somehow tied to her own? Could there have been a connection between Louisa's past and the person who took her life? The police dug into Louisa's personal history, looking for any connection that might explain why she was targeted. They examined her relationships, but they found no immediate clues. Her late husband, though he had been a respected political figure in their community, had no known enemies. Their marriage had not been marked by scandal or animosity. But as time went on, investigators began to wonder if the true motive lay deeper than anyone had anticipated. Was Louisa's murder the culmination of a long-hidden vendetta? Or was it simply the act of a disturbed individual? A crime of passion that could never be fully understood? The lack of answers in the immediate investigation made Louisa's case particularly haunting. She was a woman of no remarkable wealth, no significant enemies, and no scandalous past. And yet her life was snuffed out in the most violent way imaginable. The lack of answers only deepened the mystery. Years passed, and the case went cold. It remained unsolved for over 50 years. And as the decades passed, Louisa's name became associated with one of Britain's oldest cold cases. The investigation went quiet, and many assumed that the case would never be solved. But in 2023, something unexpected happened. Advances in forensic technology, particularly the growth of DNA analysis, would provide a new avenue for investigators. In 2023, Avon and Somerset Police, under Operation Beetle, decided to revisit the case, reviewing all available evidence. At first, it seemed like a long shot, a case so old, with little evidence left to analyze. But as it turned out, a key piece of evidence had been preserved all along: Louisa's blue skirt, which had been worn on the night of her death. DNA analysis of the skirt would eventually prove to be the breakthrough investigators had been hoping for. The DNA found on the skirt was linked to Ryland Headley, a man who had a long history of criminal behavior and had been arrested years earlier for unrelated crimes. Headley had been in the National DNA Database since 2012, and a match was finally made in 2024. But who was Headley, and why had he killed Louisa? What had prompted a man in his 30s to violently end the life of a 75-year-old woman? Louisa Dunne's murder was a crime that seemed inexplicable in its time. She was an elderly woman, living alone, and had no apparent enemies. The case was buried under decades of time and unanswered questions, and it seemed like it would remain unsolved. But with the advancements of forensic science and a renewed commitment to solving cold cases, the truth was finally uncovered. However, the more we learn about Louisa's death, the more we are left wondering. What prompted Ryland Headley to commit such a brutal act? Was it purely random violence? Or was there something deeper at play? Was Louisa just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was her murder a premeditated act, driven by something more sinister? As we move forward in the next chapters of this documentary, we will delve into the startling discoveries that led to Headley's conviction and explore the long road to justice for Louisa Dunne. The question remains, what drove Headley to murder an elderly woman? And what does it tell us about the nature of violence and human cruelty? The answers, though delayed, will finally shed light on one of the most haunting cases in British criminal history. The murder of Louisa Dunne, which shocked the small community of Easton, Bristol, was an event that, at the time, appeared as though it would remain a tragic mystery forever. After the discovery of her body on June 29, 1967, the police worked tirelessly, combing through the evidence and conducting numerous interviews. Yet, the lack of leads and substantial clues left the investigation stalled. What happened to Louisa, who could have taken the life of this elderly widow, seemingly without motive? As the years went on and the investigation grew colder, the question that haunted everyone was this: would Louisa's murder ever be solved? At first, it seemed like the police were on the right track. They explored multiple possibilities, including the theory that Louisa's murder could have been a botched robbery. But as investigators examined the scene more closely, they realized that this theory didn't hold water. Louisa's home showed no signs of forced entry, and her possessions remained untouched. There were no valuables missing, not even her pension money, which she had relied on for daily living. With no clear motive for robbery or any immediate clues to point to a suspect, the investigation quickly grew frustrating. One of the earliest theories considered was that the murder was a crime of passion, perhaps the result of a personal vendetta or a relationship gone awry. But Louisa had no known enemies, and her relatively quiet and solitary life meant that there were few people who would have had any particular reason to harm her. This lack of a clear motive added to the complexity of the case. The police's search for a suspect was like trying to find a needle in a haystack, and after weeks of interviews, fingerprint analysis, and investigation, they were no closer to an answer. It wasn't long before the case started to fade from public attention. As time passed, the likelihood of finding Louisa's killer seemed to diminish. Her death became just another unresolved murder, buried under the weight of countless other unsolved cases. How many other people in the UK had experienced a similar fate? Violence with no answers, a life extinguished and left behind with no justice. Was this the natural conclusion to Louisa's story? A tragic but unsolvable end? Or was there something more? Something waiting to be uncovered? For over 50 years, the murder of Louisa Dunne remained unsolved. Every year, the police revisited the case, but each time they came up empty-handed. As the decades passed, the details of the crime began to fade into obscurity. The Easton neighborhood had moved on, and so had the investigators. Louisa's death became little more than a forgotten file in the vast archives of unsolved crimes. But what happens when a case that has grown cold is finally given a second chance? How can new eyes on old evidence offer hope where none seemed possible? Louisa's case remained dormant for years, but with the development of new forensic technology, particularly DNA analysis, a new chapter was about to be written. The question on everyone's mind: could this breakthrough technology finally unlock the mystery of Louisa's death, which had remained a ghost from the past for so long? In 2023, nearly 6 decades after Louisa's murder, Avon and Somerset police made the bold decision to revisit the case. The decision to reopen cold cases is never taken lightly. With new technology and improved investigative techniques, they knew that they had a better chance of uncovering answers that had eluded previous generations. The catalyst for this new investigation was forensic science, the ability to test DNA evidence, something that was not available during the original investigation. The breakthrough came in the form of a single seemingly insignificant item: Louisa's blue skirt, which had been preserved as part of the evidence collected at the time of her death. It was an item that had been overlooked or considered irrelevant during the initial investigation. But with advancements in forensic DNA testing, The police believed it might hold the key to identifying Louisa's killer. This moment marked the first real hope in the decades-long search for justice. What could they uncover from this piece of clothing? Was it possible that Louisa's murderer had left behind more than just a crime scene? Could the DNA on the skirt be the key that unlocked the mystery, allowing investigators to finally identify the killer who had been free for over 5 decades? As the forensic team analyzed the evidence, a surprising revelation emerged. The DNA on Louisa's skirt matched that of a man named Ryland Headley. This discovery came as a shock, not only because of the length of time that had passed since the crime, but also because of who Headley was and the details surrounding his life. Ryland Headley, now a 92-year-old man living in Ipswich, had been arrested in 2012 for an unrelated crime. His DNA had been added to the national database, and it was this database that eventually led investigators to him. What made Headley's involvement even more startling was that he had a history of criminal behavior, including a conviction in 1977 for the rape of 2 elderly women. These crimes had taken place years after Louisa's death, but they added a chilling layer to his connection to the case. Why had Headley, in his 30s at the time of Louisa's murder, killed an elderly woman? Was this simply the act of a serial offender, or was there something more personal driving him to murder that night in June 1967? How had Headley managed to escape justice for so long? What had motivated him to target Louisa? And why had he gone unpunished for so many years? While the discovery of Headley's DNA was groundbreaking, it only led to more questions. Headley's past was far from clear, and investigators now had the difficult task of piecing together the details of his life to understand what could have driven him to commit such a violent crime. As the police looked deeper into Headley's history, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. In 1977, he had been convicted of raping 2 elderly women in Ipswich, though his sentence was controversially reduced on appeal. Was this a simple pattern of criminal behavior, or was there something more to Headley's motives, something that tied his earlier crimes to Louisa's murder? What was it about Louisa that made her a victim in Headley's eyes? Was her age, her isolation, or her vulnerability a factor? Was this a random encounter, or did Headley know Louisa, perhaps from an earlier period in his life? The possibility that he had targeted Louisa, a woman living alone in a modest home, makes one question the underlying motivations of such acts of violence. Was it a crime of opportunity, or was there something personal at play? And if there was something personal, why had it taken so long for the killer to be brought to justice? Even after the DNA match and Headley's eventual arrest, many questions remain unanswered. What other unsolved cases might there be that involve Headley or people like him? How many victims were there before Louisa? And how many would there be after? How did Headley, now in his 90s, evade justice for so long? Was the delay in solving this case simply a matter of time? Or were there systemic failures that allowed this man to continue his violent behavior unchecked? The year 2025 marked the beginning of a new chapter for the case of Louisa Dunne. In June of that year, Ryland Headley was put on trial for the rape and murder of Louisa Dunne. The trial was a long-awaited moment for justice, but it was also a moment of reckoning. The years of pain, frustration, and unanswered questions that had plagued Louisa's family and the community were now on the cusp of being resolved. During the trial, the prosecution presented the evidence gathered over the years, DNA samples, palm prints, and the forensic analysis that finally connected Headley to the crime. The evidence was overwhelming, and the case that had remained unsolved for so long now seemed ready to reach its conclusion. On June 30th, 2025, the jury found Headley guilty of both the rape and murder of Louisa Dunne. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 20 years. It was a victory for justice, but it also raised troubling questions about the nature of Headley's crimes and the way they were handled over the years. How many lives had been affected by the delay in bringing Headley to justice? How many victims had there been before Louisa, and how many after? The conviction of Ryland Headley brought a sense of closure to Louisa's family and the community that had long been haunted by her unsolved murder. But Louisa's case also raised a broader question. How many other cold cases remain unresolved, waiting for the breakthroughs in technology and investigation that Louisa's case finally received? Louisa's murder may have been the catalyst for justice, But what about all the other victims who have yet to see their killers brought to justice? The case of Louisa Dunne, from its beginnings as a baffling unsolved mystery to its eventual resolution through DNA analysis, serves as a powerful reminder of the relentless pursuit of justice. It shows that no matter how much time has passed, there is always the possibility of discovery, of unearthing the truth, even from the most stubborn and seemingly impossible cases. In the end, Louisa's story is not just a tale of tragedy and loss. It is a story of resilience of science and of the belief that justice, no matter how delayed, can and will be served. Louisa's case may have been one of the longest unsolved mysteries in British criminal history, but in the end it was a testament to the power of persistence, the advancement of technology, and the relentless drive to uncover the truth. The unraveling of the mystery behind Louisa Dunne's murder in 1967 was only the beginning. As the name of Ryland Headley emerged from the shadows of the cold case, the question that lingered was this: who exactly was this man, and what led him to commit such a brutal crime? The revelation that a 92-year-old man, after decades of freedom, was behind Louisa's death shocked the public and left more questions than answers. What did Ryland Headley's history reveal about his character? What drove a man in his 30s to kill a defenseless elderly woman? And why did it take over 50 years to bring him to justice? Ryland Headley was born in 1932 in the Caribbean. His early life was marked by circumstances that led him to emigrate to the UK in 1952, during the post-war period, when migration to Britain was encouraged by the government as part of the Windrush generation. Settling in Bristol, Headley would go on to lead a life marked by violent crime, which would eventually tie him to the murder of Louisa Dunne. What makes the discovery of Headley's involvement in Louisa's murder particularly chilling is the fact that, despite his criminal past, he had been able to fly under the radar for so many years. After moving to the UK, Headley became involved in several criminal activities. His crimes were not confined to one incident but spanned multiple years, and his previous run-ins with the law suggested a pattern of violent tendencies. How did such a man manage to evade serious consequences for his actions for so long? In the 1970s, after his involvement in a brutal sexual assault case, Headley was convicted of the rape of 2 elderly women in Ipswich. These crimes were horrific, yet somehow Headley was able to continue his life, with his sentence being controversially reduced on appeal. Was this a case of leniency in the judicial system, or was it an oversight that allowed a man like Headley to continue preying on vulnerable individuals? This question begs a larger reflection. How often do violent offenders slip through the cracks, allowed to continue their lives without facing the full weight of justice? After serving a brief sentence for the 1977 crimes, Headley moved to Ipswich, and it appeared that he had disappeared from the radar. Was the fact that he had been convicted of sexual assault and yet allowed to resume his life a major oversight? Were the authorities fully aware of the dangerous nature of the man they were dealing with? How many other lives were affected by the system's failure to act decisively? While Headley had become known for his violent tendencies, it was the chilling connection to Louisa Dunne that truly brought his past into the light. When DNA evidence linked him to the crime scene in 2023, it became clear that Headley had not only evaded punishment for his prior offenses, but had also managed to escape detection for his involvement in Louisa's murder for decades. Why was Louisa, a 75-year-old widow, targeted by a man who had already demonstrated his capacity for violence? What did Louisa's situation, living alone and in relative seclusion, have to do with Headley's choice of victim? Did the vulnerability of elderly women play a role in his decision to commit such heinous acts? In 1967, Headley would have been in his mid-30s, a man already showing signs of violent and predatory behavior. Louisa's home, a modest property in Easton, Bristol, seemed like an unlikely target for a stranger. But could it be that Headley had been lurking in the shadows of Louisa's life? Was he someone who had known her in the past? Or was this a crime of opportunity, a cold and calculated act? The question looms. Was Louisa merely the unfortunate victim of a man who saw her as an easy target? Or was there a deeper, more sinister motive that tied Headley to her? What was it about Headley's psychology that made him capable of committing such violence? His history of sexual violence indicated a disregard for human life. But was there something more troubling behind his action, something buried within his mind that made him choose victims like Louisa? And what made him feel that he could get away with such a crime? Could it have been arrogance? The belief that, given his past, he could slip back into obscurity without ever facing the consequences? The discovery of Headley's DNA on Louisa's skirt in 2023 made him a central figure in the investigation. But his history of violent behavior added another layer of complexity to his profile. The earlier convictions for the rape of 2 elderly women in 1977 painted a disturbing picture of his tendencies. But it was his subsequent life, free from the consequences of those crimes, that prompted further reflection on how the system had failed to stop him. Could Headley's history of criminal behavior have been avoided? What should have been the warning signs that alerted authorities to the danger he posed? The fact that he was allowed to continue his life unchecked raises questions about the justice system's ability to manage individuals with violent histories. Was his life of relative freedom a consequence of oversight, or a result of systemic failure that allowed him to continue committing crimes without facing significant punishment? The question must be asked, how many other victims could there have been before and after Louisa? Was Louisa simply one in a long line of overlooked victims of a man who should have been locked away for good after his 1977 crimes? And if Louisa had been his final victim, how many others might there have been? This chilling thought leaves us questioning whether the systems in place to protect vulnerable individuals, like Louisa, were simply not enough to prevent a man like Headley from continuing his violent path. To understand Headley's actions, it's important to consider the psychology of a man who would commit such heinous acts. What makes someone like Headley a serial offender? Is there a deeper, more ingrained mental disorder or emotional disturbance that would drive a man to repeatedly commit violent crimes against vulnerable individuals, as he did with Louisa and his previous victims? Research into criminal behavior suggests that violent offenders like Headley often exhibit patterns of behavior that escalate over time. Was Louisa's murder part of an ongoing, unchecked escalation in Headley's criminal activity? What does his history tell us about his mindset and motivations? Was his violent crime against Louisa merely an expression of his desire for control, or was it rooted in something more psychologically complex? One thing is clear: Headley was no stranger to violence, and his past crimes show that he had the capacity to escalate his behavior over time. But could there have been other factors, such as a personal experience or unresolved trauma, that contributed to his violent tendencies? Or was Headley simply a product of his environment, one who found himself drawn to a life of violence because he was allowed to get away with it for so long? The public's reaction to Headley's involvement in Louisa's murder was one of shock and disbelief. How could a man in his 90s, who had lived most of his life out of the public eye, be revealed to have committed such an unspeakable act decades earlier? And why, after so many years, was justice finally served? This delayed resolution raised the question: how many other cases were there where justice was too late, and victims were left without answers for far too long? The trial of Ryland Headley in 2025 was a long-awaited moment of justice for Louisa's family and the community at large. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the fact that DNA testing had finally linked him to the crime was a testament to the power of modern forensic science. Yet as the trial progressed, it became clear that this case was about more than just Headley. It was about the failures in the system that allowed him to evade justice for so long. What does Headley's conviction say about the criminal justice system? What lessons can we learn from a case that took over 50 years to solve? And what do we need to do to ensure that future victims are not forgotten, that their killers do not slip through the cracks as Headley did? These are questions that challenge our sense of justice and make us rethink how we approach criminal behavior and its consequences. The conviction of Ryland Headley brought closure to Louisa Dunne's family. It also raised troubling questions about the failures of the criminal justice system. Headley, despite his history of violence, was allowed to live freely for decades, committing more crimes without facing the consequences. The story of Louisa's murder and the eventual resolution through DNA analysis serves as a powerful reminder of how justice can be delayed but not denied. However, the larger question remains: how many other cases are there like Louisa's? How many victims are out there, waiting for the truth to be uncovered? And how can we ensure that no other individuals, like Ryland Headley, are allowed to continue their violent paths unchecked? The legacy of Louisa Dunne and Ryland Headley forces us to confront these difficult questions and reflect on the state of our justice system, our society, and the vulnerable individuals we must protect. In the years following Louisa Dunne's tragic death in 1967, the murder became one of Britain's most baffling and enduring cold cases. For over 5 decades, the brutal killing of the 75-year-old widow remained unsolved, overshadowed by time and the failure of initial investigations. However, the dramatic resolution of the case in 2025, with Ryland Headley's conviction for her murder, sent shockwaves through the community and the wider public. The question that many found themselves asking was, how could justice be so delayed? Was the pursuit of justice compromised by systemic failures? Or was this simply the result of a long unsolved case finally meeting modern forensic technology? The trial of Ryland Headley, after decades of living free from his crime, was a historic moment not just for the Dunne family, but for the criminal justice system. But as this long-awaited moment of justice unfolded, several critical questions arose. Was this trial simply a formality, a final piece of the puzzle? Or did it shine a light on the flaws that had allowed Headley to escape punishment for so long? The trial against Ryland Headley began in 2025, nearly 6 decades after Louisa Dunne's death. The case was reopened in 2023 when the breakthrough DNA analysis of Louisa's skirt led investigators to a match with Headley's DNA. The scientific evidence that brought Headley to trial was irrefutable. What made this case so extraordinary was the technology that made it possible. The use of DNA matching, a tool that simply didn't exist when Louisa's murder was first investigated in the 1960s. The DNA evidence on Louisa's clothing was the key that unlocked the mystery. It revealed that Headley's genetic material had been left on Louisa's skirt, making the connection between him and the crime undeniable. But the question that many still asked was, how did a man who had been convicted of similar crimes, like the rape of 2 elderly women in Ipswich, remain free for so long without anyone connecting him to Louisa's murder? In addition to the DNA evidence, Headley's palm print was found on Louisa's window, another significant breakthrough that linked him directly to the crime scene. The physical evidence, once analyzed, confirmed the suspicions and pointed unequivocally to Headley as Louisa's murderer. Yet while the evidence seemed clear, the question remained, what was the motive behind Louisa's murder? Was it simply the act of a man with a history of violence, or was there something deeper, some hidden connection between him and Louisa that had yet to be revealed? As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented a compelling case. The forensic evidence was damning, and Headley's past criminal behavior added to the weight of the charges. But what did Headley's involvement in Louisa's death say about the criminal justice system? How could a man who had already shown violent tendencies be allowed to continue his life without facing significant consequences for his actions? The trial raised serious questions about the ability of the justice system to protect society from serial offenders. Was this a case of negligence, or was it simply the result of a system that failed to connect the dots in time? As the trial unfolded, the public's reaction to the revelation of Headley's identity and the years it had taken for justice to be served was one of disbelief. How could a man who had been free for so long, living in Ipswich, evade detection for such a brutal crime? How was it possible that for decades, Louisa Dunne's murder had been ignored by the very system that was supposed to bring her justice? The fact that Headley had lived a relatively quiet life after his previous convictions only fueled public outrage. For many, the trial was not just about Louisa's murder. It was about the systemic failures that allowed Headley to continue his life without facing the consequences of his past crimes. The fact that Headley had been free to commit further offenses, such as the rape of 2 elderly women, while Louisa's murder remained unsolved for decades, was a source of widespread frustration. The question remains, what could have been done differently? Why did it take so long for the authorities to piece together the evidence that would eventually lead to Headley's arrest? Was it simply a matter of time and technology? Or did the system fail to adequately connect the dots in a timely manner? The public outcry was not just about Headley's crimes. It was about the feeling that justice had been delayed for too long. The families of Louisa Dunne and other victims of Headley's violence had waited far too long for the truth to come to light. But did the trial bring closure? Or did it simply expose the failings of the system? As expected, Headley's defense team tried to discredit the evidence and cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that the DNA evidence was inconclusive and that Headley had been wrongfully implicated in the crime. Their strategy was to sow confusion and attempt to weaken the case against Headley. But the evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming. Despite the defense's attempts to undermine the case, the prosecution's forensic evidence, combined with Headley's criminal history, made it impossible for the jury to ignore the truth. The fact that Headley's DNA was found on Louisa's skirt and his palm print on her window left no room for reasonable doubt. The defense's arguments seemed almost trivial in comparison to the magnitude of the evidence presented by the prosecution. However, the question remains, why did Headley, who had a long history of criminal violence, feel the need to defend himself at all? What was going through his mind as he stood trial for a crime that had been committed nearly 6 decades earlier? Was he truly unaware of the consequences of his actions? Or was his behavior a reflection of a man who had learned to evade punishment throughout his life? And how did he reconcile the man he had become with the brutality of Louisa's murder? These are the questions that lingered during the trial. Questions about Headley's own understanding of his violent tendencies and whether he believed he could continue to escape the consequences of his actions. On June 30th, 2025, the jury found Ryland Headley guilty of both the rape and murder of Louisa Dunne. The judge, in his sentencing, made it clear that Headley's violent past and the horrific nature of the crime left him with no other option but to impose the harshest possible sentence. Headley was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 20 years. Judge Derek Sweeting, in a statement, said, "You will never be released. You will die in prison." For Louisa's family, the conviction brought a sense of closure. Finally, after more than 50 years, the truth was known, and justice had been served. Yet, despite the conviction, there was still a sense of sorrow. The family was forced to confront the fact that Louisa's life had been taken by a man who should never have been free to harm anyone in the first place. The fact that Headley had been allowed to walk free for so long, committing further crimes, left a lingering sense of injustice that no conviction could fully erase. For the wider community, the case served as a stark reminder of the gaps in the criminal justice system. How many other victims could there have been? How many offenders, like Headley, had slipped through the cracks, allowed to continue their lives without facing the full consequences of their actions? The case forced a national conversation about the failures of the system and the need for reforms in the way violent offenders are treated and monitored. The conviction of Ryland Headley is, at its core, a victory for justice. But it also raises difficult questions about the way society deals with violent offenders. How many other cases, like Louisa's, remain unsolved due to a lack of resources, oversight, or attention? What does it say about a justice system that allows a man with a history of violence to remain free for decades, committing further crimes, until science finally catches up? The case of Louisa Dunne is not just a tragic story about an elderly woman's death. It is a reflection of the flaws in the criminal justice system. It highlights the need for better mechanisms to track and manage offenders, particularly those with a history of violent crime. It asks difficult questions about how justice can be delayed and what must be done to ensure that such delays are avoided in the future. As we reflect on this case, the haunting question remains: how many victims are still out there, waiting for justice? How many Ryland Headleys are still free, unnoticed, and undeterred by the consequences of their actions? The Louisa Dunne case serves as a reminder of the vigilance we must maintain to ensure that justice is never delayed, and that the systems meant to protect us are always functioning at their best. The trial of Ryland Headley brought an end to one of Britain's most infamous cold cases. But it also left us grappling with larger questions about justice, the criminal justice system, and the lasting impact of systemic failures. The conviction may have brought closure to Louisa's family, but it opened a deeper conversation about how we protect society's most vulnerable. The true cost of justice, as Louisa's case shows, is measured not just in convictions, but in the time lost, the lives affected, and the lingering questions about how we can prevent such tragedies from ever happening again. The murder of Louisa Dunne was not just a tragic event for the elderly woman herself. It was a moment that reverberated through the lives of her family, friends, and the entire Easton, Bristol community. For over 50 years, the case of her brutal murder remained unsolved, leaving her family in a state of perpetual uncertainty. In the absence of answers, the emotional toll was immense. However, when the case was finally reopened in 2023, leading to the identification and conviction of Ryland Headley in 2025, it prompted a range of emotional responses, from relief to sorrow, from a sense of justice to a recognition of the deeper systemic issues in the criminal justice system. This chapter seeks to explore the profound impact Louisa Dunne's murder and its eventual resolution had on her family, as well as the wider community. How did the delayed pursuit of justice shape the lives of those closest to her? And what lessons can be learned from this case about the long-term effects of unresolved violence on a community? Louisa's family had lived with the haunting reality of her murder for decades. For Louisa's children, nieces, nephews, and grandchildren, the unresolved nature of the case created an atmosphere of tension and anxiety. The murder of a loved one is a devastating event, but when it remains unsolved, it adds an additional layer of grief, a sense of powerlessness, of not knowing why or how someone they loved was taken from them. Imagine, for a moment, the anguish of living with the uncertainty of not knowing who killed your loved one. How does this shape relationships within the family? Does the inability to mourn properly, without answers, leave emotional scars that affect future generations? For decades, Louisa's family was forced to contend with the painful reality that they might never know the truth behind her death. As the years wore on, they watched as new technologies were developed, cold cases were solved, and other families found closure. Yet Louisa's case remained untouched. As one can imagine, this lack of progress was not only emotionally draining, but it also led to frustration with the system that failed to provide the answers they so desperately needed. In the absence of a resolution, Louisa's family was left with nothing but their own memories of her. As time passed, those memories became more distant. It is a painful truth that the passage of time often causes the emotional pain of loss to become more muted. But the unresolved nature of Louisa's murder ensured that her family could never fully heal. The reopening of Louisa's case in 2023 was, for her family, an emotional roller coaster. While there was hope that new forensic techniques would finally bring them the answers they had been longing for, there was also a great deal of fear and uncertainty. What would the investigation reveal? Could they finally uncover the truth? Or would they face another painful disappointment? The moment the DNA match linked Ryland Headley to Louisa's murder, the relief within the family was palpable. For the first time in decades, they could breathe a sigh of relief. The name of the killer was finally known. However, this revelation was also bittersweet. After so many years, the family was forced to confront the harsh reality that Louisa had suffered a brutal death at the hands of a man who had been free to live his life for decades. The justice they had been denied for so long was now finally within their grasp, but it had taken far too long to achieve. While the family may have felt a sense of justice upon hearing of Headley's conviction, it also underscored the trauma they had experienced. It was not just the grief of losing Louisa that haunted them. It was the painful reality of having been denied closure for so many years. The prolonged uncertainty had affected not only Louisa's immediate family members, but also the generations that followed. For her children or grandchildren, and those who loved her, the unresolved nature of the case left an emotional scar that could never be fully erased. How does an unresolved case like this shape the emotional well-being of a family over time? What toll does the uncertainty of not knowing who killed a loved one take on the psyche of those left behind? The emotional damage caused by Louisa's death was not something that could be easily healed. Even with the conviction of her killer, the pain of the years without answers lingered. The family was forced to live with a sense of powerlessness for decades. And while the trial and Headley's eventual conviction marked the closing of one chapter for Louisa's family, it was also a reminder of all they had lost, both emotionally and time-wise. The journey of pain, uncertainty, and frustration left a mark that no verdict could entirely undo. The impact of a cold case on the survivors, those who live with the haunting reality of not knowing, is profound. The lack of resolution can lead to a range of emotional and psychological consequences, from a sense of hopelessness to a deep sense of injustice. This emotional turmoil often persists far beyond the initial tragedy, as those affected struggle with feelings of abandonment by the justice system. For families of murder victims, living with uncertainty can lead to feelings of emotional numbness, unresolved grief, and a constant gnawing desire for closure. Without answers, survivors may find it difficult to move on and may, in some cases, experience depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress. Louisa's family undoubtedly experienced this prolonged emotional strain. For years, they had no recourse, no closure. The psychological burden that comes with such an unresolved tragedy is not something that can be easily quantified. It is undeniable. The lingering trauma that families of cold case victims experience raises an important question. How can society better support those left in the wake of violent crimes, particularly when the answers they desperately seek are out of reach for so long? In addition to its emotional impact on Louisa's family, her murder had a profound effect on the Easton community. For a neighborhood that prided itself on its close-knit, supportive atmosphere, the brutal nature of Louisa's death shook residents to their core. Easton was a working-class area, and Louisa, known for her friendly demeanor and community involvement, was a familiar and respected figure. Her murder seemed out of place in this quiet neighborhood, a horrifying anomaly that left everyone questioning the safety of their own homes. The fact that Louisa's murder remained unsolved for so long left a lingering sense of fear and distrust in the community. How could such a violent crime occur in the heart of a seemingly peaceful neighborhood? Were there other dangers lurking, unseen by the public? The unresolved nature of the crime created a sense of unease that permeated the community for decades. What does it mean for a community when its sense of safety is shattered, but no answers are forthcoming? In the absence of closure, the residents of Easton lived with a sense of collective trauma. The shadow of Louisa's death loomed over the community for decades, and the unsolved murder became a point of conversation and speculation. But as time passed, the case became part of the neighborhood's folklore, a tragedy that no one seemed able to escape. Louisa's case also revealed deeper systemic issues within the criminal justice system. The fact that it took over 50 years for a killer to be brought to justice points to significant failures in how cold cases are handled and how criminals like Ryland Headley are tracked and managed. Headley, a man with a history of violent crime, was able to evade justice for so long because of a combination of factors: an incomplete or inadequate investigation, a failure to track offenders over time, and a lack of resources dedicated to solving cold cases. The question that remains is, how many other cases like Louisa's are out there, still unsolved and languishing in the archives of forgotten crimes? How many families are living with the same uncertainty and fear that Louisa's family faced for over 5 decades? How many violent criminals are walking free, evading justice, simply because the system was unable to connect the dots in time? For Louisa's family and the Easton community, the conviction of Ryland Headley in 2025 was a significant step toward healing. While it may never undo the pain of Louisa's death or the decades of uncertainty, it allowed the family to begin to find closure. The fact that justice was finally served after so many years provided a sense of catharsis, a feeling that the long wait for answers had not been in vain. But the emotional impact of Louisa's murder will never fully disappear. It's a wound that will take generations to heal. The families and the community were forever changed by this experience, forced to reckon with the emotional scars that come with living through a long unsolved tragedy. While the conviction of Headley brought justice, it also forced people to confront the realities of a system that failed to protect and serve in a timely manner. The murder of Louisa Dunne will forever be a painful chapter in the history of Easton, Bristol. The long wait for justice and the deep emotional toll it took on Louisa's family and the community is a sobering reminder of how devastating unresolved violence can be. But the eventual resolution of Louisa's case, thanks to advances in forensic technology and the unyielding pursuit of justice, offers a glimmer of hope. It proves that even the most distant tragedies can be brought to light, even if justice comes too late for those who suffer the most. Yet, as we reflect on Louisa's case, we are left with a thought-provoking question. How many other victims are still waiting for their day in court, their chance to have their stories heard and their killers brought to justice? And how can we ensure that no other family has to wait 50 years for closure? The story of Louisa Dunne's brutal murder, The investigation that spanned over 5 decades and the eventual conviction of Ryland Headley in 2025 leaves a profound legacy. While the conviction of Headley brought much-needed closure to Louisa's family and the Easton community, it also raised important questions about the functioning of the criminal justice system, the handling of cold cases, and the long-term impact of unresolved violent crimes. What does this case teach us about the vulnerabilities of the justice system? And what can we do to ensure that similar cases do not linger for decades without resolution? How can this case be used to improve the way we handle unsolved crimes, protect victims, and prevent future tragedies? As we reflect on Louisa Dunne's story, we must consider the broader implications that extend far beyond her individual case. It is not just a story about one woman's death. It is a case that exposes the systemic challenges within law enforcement, forensic science, and the public's understanding of how justice is served. The story of Louisa's murder has much to teach us about persistence, resilience, and the ways in which justice can be delayed but ultimately achieved. Cold cases, unsolved criminal investigations that remain unresolved for extended periods, are not a new phenomenon. Louisa's case highlights the inherent challenges that law enforcement faces when trying to solve crimes long after the fact. Cold cases often have limited physical evidence, fading witness memories, and a lack of technological tools to help investigators make breakthroughs. It raises the essential question: how can investigators effectively pursue justice when time itself works against them? In the case of Louisa Dunne, the investigation was eventually revived through advancements in forensic science, specifically DNA testing. However, it wasn't just science that solved the case. It was a decision by Avon and Somerset police to reopen a case that many had long since given up on. This case serves as a powerful reminder that law enforcement agencies must prioritize the revisiting of cold cases, applying modern technology and techniques, and using all available resources to solve old crimes. However, how many cold cases still remain unsolved, left to gather dust in police archives because they lack the resources or attention they need to be revisited? What would the cost of reopening those cases be? And is it something that our criminal justice system can afford to ignore? Louisa's case proves that even the oldest cases can be solved with the right tools and dedication. The question is, what would it take for the justice system to apply this level of commitment to all cold cases? One of the most unsettling aspects of Louisa's case is the fact that Ryland Headley was able to evade justice for decades. Despite his history of violent crime, including the rape of 2 elderly women in Ipswich in 1977, Headley was not properly monitored or prevented from committing further offenses. How is it possible that a man with such a violent history was allowed to live freely for so long, while Louisa Dunne's family suffered the pain of not knowing the truth? This raises uncomfortable but necessary questions about how the justice system handles repeat offenders, particularly those with a history of violence. Could this case have been prevented had Headley been monitored more closely after his 1977 conviction? Did the system fail to properly address his potential as a serial offender? As we reflect on this, it becomes clear that a failure to track and monitor repeat offenders, especially those who have already demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence, leaves victims vulnerable. Headley's freedom for so many years highlights the need for more stringent monitoring of individuals who pose a serious threat to public safety. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we prioritize and protect vulnerable members of society. So, how can we ensure that repeat offenders do not slip through the cracks? What changes are needed to prevent future tragedies like Louisa's? Could a more proactive, preventative approach to monitoring high-risk offenders have changed the outcome for Louisa and others like her? The breakthrough in Louisa's case came in the form of modern forensic technology, DNA analysis. When DNA from Louisa's skirt matched Ryland Headley's, it finally provided the evidence needed to solve the case. But the question arises, how many more cold cases could be solved if forensic technology were more widely available and accessible? And how much more could we achieve if there were a greater emphasis on using technology to bring justice to the victims of unsolved crimes? DNA testing has revolutionized the criminal justice system, allowing law enforcement agencies to identify suspects with unprecedented accuracy. Yet, not every case has the benefit of this kind of technology. What happens to the cases that lack DNA evidence or are not amenable to modern forensic methods? What are we doing to ensure that those cases, often the most difficult to solve, get the attention and resources they deserve? In Louisa's case, it was DNA that provided the crucial link to her killer. But this was only possible because of the resources and time invested into revisiting cold cases. What does this tell us about the need for a broader, systemic commitment to cold case investigations? Should forensic technology be universally applied? Or are there simply too many cases for law enforcement to handle? And as we look forward, how can we ensure that this powerful tool is used to its fullest potential for justice? For Louisa's family, the resolution of the case was a bittersweet moment. While they finally got the answers they had been seeking for more than 5 decades, they were also forced to confront the painful reality of a long wait for justice. The emotional toll of living without answers for so many years is something that cannot be easily quantified. How does a family reconcile with the fact that their loved one's killer lived freely for so long, while they endured the agony of uncertainty? The delay in justice raises larger, more profound questions. What is the cost of delayed justice on the mental and emotional well-being of the victims' families? How many families are still waiting for answers, living in a constant state of trauma, unable to fully heal? Is it fair to ask families to endure such a long and painful wait for closure? What toll does it take on them? The story of Louisa's family highlights the need for a more compassionate and proactive approach to solving unsolved crimes. The emotional strain of living in uncertainty can have lasting consequences, and this case serves as a stark reminder that justice should not be delayed. It forces us to question how we can better support families affected by violent crime and ensure that they are not left in a state of perpetual limbo. For the community of Easton, Louisa's murder was a wound that never fully healed. Easton was a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other. The brutal murder of one of its residents, a woman who had lived quietly and contributed to her community, left a deep scar. The unresolved nature of the case only added to the sense of insecurity and fear. How could something so horrific happen in a neighborhood like theirs? And what did it mean that no one was ever caught for so long? The reopening of the case in 2023 and the eventual conviction of Headley in 2025 provided a sense of justice not only for Louisa's family, but also for the community that had long lived with the uncertainty of her killer's identity. For the residents of Easton, the case was not just about solving the murder of one woman. It was about restoring their sense of security and rebuilding trust in the justice system. However, the community's healing process did not end with Headley's conviction. The decades of fear, uncertainty, and frustration would leave lingering effects. How can a community truly heal from the scars of such a tragedy? Can the sense of safety ever fully return after a crime like Louisa's, especially when justice is delayed for so long? Louisa's case forces us to consider the broader implications of violent crime on communities. It is not just the individual victim who suffers. It is the collective community that is impacted by the loss. What can be done to better support communities in the aftermath of unsolved crimes? And how can we ensure that these communities feel safe, knowing that justice is being pursued? The conviction of Ryland Headley in 2025 brought an end to one of Britain's most long-standing cold cases. But it also left us with a series of critical questions and reflections about the state of the justice system. How can we ensure that cold cases are never ignored again? How do we provide better support for families and communities affected by unresolved violence? And how can we work toward a system where justice is not only served, but is served in a timely and compassionate manner? Louisa Dunne's case shows us that justice, though delayed, is still possible. It is a story of perseverance, of science, and of the human drive to seek truth. But it also serves as a wake-up call, a reminder that we must continually strive to improve our systems and institutions so that no more families have to wait decades for closure. As we move forward, we must ask ourselves, what changes can we make to ensure that justice is not only done, but is done swiftly, fairly, and without delay? The road to justice is often long and winding, but as Louisa Dunne's case demonstrates, it is a road that can and must be walked. The question that looms largest at the conclusion of this case is, how can we prevent future tragedies from being delayed for so long? How many more families have to suffer the uncertainty that Louisa's family faced? How many more communities need to endure the fear and anxiety of unsolved crimes before we make changes to how we handle cold cases? Is it enough to celebrate the fact that Louisa's case was solved? Or do we need to be asking ourselves what the justice system can do better to ensure that no one else has to wait 50 years for closure? Can we afford to let another victim's family wait as Louisa's did? Shouldn't we be doing more to bring justice to everyone, regardless of the age of the case? And finally, should we, as a society, be asking ourselves, how many more Ryland Headleys are out there, committing crimes that are never solved? What are we doing to ensure that they don't get away with it for decades? What steps must we take as a society to improve the way we handle and prevent future violent crimes? Louisa Dunne's case is not just a story of a crime solved. It's a call to action for all of us. It challenges us to demand more from the justice system. It challenges us to ask the difficult questions, to address the flaws, and to ensure that we are not waiting decades for justice. We owe it to Louisa, to her family, and to every victim of unsolved crimes to make sure that we never let another case sit cold for decades again. If you're moved by Louisa's case, if you feel the weight of the injustice that took so long to be resolved, join the conversation. Demand more accountability. Push for systemic changes. Advocate for the reopening of cold cases and for a stronger, more effective justice system that doesn't wait for technological breakthroughs to serve justice. It's time we make sure that justice is always within reach and that no family ever